We now have a bunch of data in, and we'd like to go ahead and fit our models to our different costs. So again, we are going to assume, and while this may not be the realistic way of doing things, but because the stock tickers do change, what we're going to assume is that for this particular day, at the end of the day, you had a cost of $50.39. On September 14th, you had a cost of $70.97. On September 15th, you had a cost of $34.45. Now, of course, this might not be in dollars, it might be in millions of dollars, but you'll notice in the project that it specifies what this number actually represents. Okay, so now we want to build a graph, and I want to do these separately. I want to fit a separate model for my cost and a separate model for my revenue. Therefore, what I'm going to do is, first of all, my x's are going to be my inputs are going to be the number of business days since September 13th. So first thing is, let's come over here and we're going to insert a scatter plot. The scatter plot will allow us to see what sort of format our data has. So if I just go to insert, hit scatter, I select the very first option, I get this empty box. The reason we're doing the empty box and we're not actually selecting our data first is because our days and then the actual costs right here are in separate rows, and they're separated by actually 3 separate rows here. So what I'm going to do is come in manually and select my data. What I do is I put my cursor over the chart area, I right click, and first highlight it, right click, and you want to select data. So now what we're going to do is actually come in here and click on add. Now add, what it's going to do is it's going to ask you for your series name. So what do you want to call this? This series name is what appears off to the side. And most of the time we're going to ignore this because we're only going to be graphing one function at a time. So I'm going to leave this empty. I'm going to select my x values. X values are our days. So I'll come over here and click on this button to be able to select my range. So what I do now is it's ready for me to select my inputs. I start at my very first one, drag to the very last day, release my mouse button, and press this button again. Now what that does is that tells Excel where to go looking for my inputs. So it says go to sheet 1, which in Excel there are a variety of different sheets. We might talk about those later. And now I need to select, and it goes from cells D3 all the way through M3. Here's D3, here's M3. Now for my Y values, I'm going to do the same thing, except I'm going to start by modeling my costs. So I'm going to select all of these corresponding Y values. Now the important part is you want to make sure that you select the same number of X values as you do Y values. So the general trick is you want to make sure that basically if there are 10 values selected for your Y's, you have to have 10 values for your X. So here's our scatter plot. According to this randomness, so I hit OK again to close out of it. And now I don't like this series thing, I don't really care to have that, so I can just click it and hit delete, and that will disappear and adjust my graph for me. If I'd like to adjust the size, I can come over to the corners and you can see that these double arrows, I can pull this and make it bigger to see it a lot better. So here are my costs, or my costs in dollars. Here are my number of days. Now what I can do is to pretty this graph up a little bit. If you click the graph and you come over to design, you can select different colors if you want. You can do red, black, all that kind of good stuff. Under layout, this allows me to give some detail to my graph. So if I come to chart title and I click on centered overlay title, you'll see that that will actually put your title on top of your data, which most people don't like. So if you do above chart, it'll pull the chart down a little bit, allow you to come in here, highlight the text, click cost data, whatever you want to call it, click off to the side, and now it's done. So if I want to label my axes, I can label by going title below axis, and I can call this business days since, etc., etc., etc. And I can do the same thing by labeling my vertical axis, and so on and so forth. Now, as we've done in the lab, what you can do to fit data to this is if you come over to trend line, so your graph has to be selected, and you hit trend line, you get a few options here, but I like it better if you go to more trend line options. Personally, I like that because I can actually see what's happening as I'm selecting different models. So I always want to have display equation on chart, and display R squared value, because this tells me, okay, how is my model doing in terms of a fit? What is the equation? Is it too complicated, etc.? Now you can see that this line is a very, very poor fit because it only gets about a 6%. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to come over and maybe modify this guy a little bit. Actually, I'm going to undo this real quick. If you ever exit out of there and you decide later that you want to come back and edit your trend line, don't click trend line again. Instead, highlight your line so that you see this little dot here and dot here. Right click it and oops, see, sometimes it's tricky and you have to click a couple of times. There it is. Right click, choose format trend line, and now you can come in here and say, well, what if I did an exponential? Nah, for this data it increased the fit a little bit but not enough. For some reason it didn't like that. Don't know why. Let's try this again. So if I do polynomial, select my equation, R squared, a little bit better. Well, what happens if I change that polynomial? Look, it jumped up to almost 40%. A little bit more, a little bit more. Oh, that's pretty darn good right there. You can see that this is about almost an 87% fit, so that's about a B. You want to think about a grade. Okay, if I want to go a little bit higher, I don't know if Excel allows you to do that, but what you don't want to do is select moving average, because that's a little bit more complicated. It's not actually an equation that you can get. But hey, for me, this data seemed to be a pretty good fit. So I'm going to select this, and now I'm done. I get to write down my equation. This right here represents my C of, I guess in this case, X. X represents the number of days since September 13th, excuse me. And I've got my equation to work with for cost. We would do the same thing for revenue, except we would go ahead and create or insert a new scatter plot and repeat steps so that we would have two comparisons, one for cost data and one for revenue data.